Okay, so we're going to talk in a little more detail about the basal ganglia circuitry. So we said that there's the motor circuitry, and then we have involvement in non-motor functions, including goal-directed behavior, social behavior, and emotion. So we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about each one of those. So the head of the caudate is part of a decision-making loop that participates in goal-directed behavior, including evaluating information for making decisions, planning, and choosing actions in context. So the example in the book is where you're driving to a job interview and you're running a little bit late. Of course, I say you should have left earlier, but that's just me. So you're running a little late, you got to get to that job interview. The green traffic light turns yellow. The head of the caudate evaluates how heavy traffic is, how much time you have, whether to risk running the light as it turns red. The caudate head evaluates the full context of potential actions and selects the appropriate one to take. So the head of the caudate is also active in learning and changes in activities when reward contingencies are reversed. So whether you're going to get a reward or you're going to get a punishment. So it's not, the goal-directed behavior loop is not involved in controlling movements. It's just involved in making perceptual decisions, planning, and choosing actions in context. So if you had that exact same situation where you were driving and the light was turning from green to yellow and you weren't on your way to a job interview and you had all the time in the world, you might make a different decision. So that's the difference of an action in context versus just any old action. So they talk about in the chapter about the experimenter is repeatedly rewarding a monkey when it picks up a cube instead of a cylinder, and then the experimenter suddenly rewards picking up the cylinder and not the cube. The caudate head is the first neural area to learn the new contingency. So I don't know if you ever played any of those cognitive games where you're guessing patterns and you have to learn what the pattern is. This is the part of our brain that is learning what that pattern is. So the link between the action chosen by the caudate head and the selected movement occurs primarily in the thalamus. So the goal-directed behavior loop sends that information to the thalamus, and then the thalamus precipitates the motion. The head of the caudate is part of the loop that recognizes social cues, regulates self-control, and parses out relevant from irrelevant information. So a lot of times, so in the driving example, they were saying instead of being you're running late to the job interview and your grandmother is with you because you have to drop her off on the way to the interview. Sounds like bad planning to me, but there you go, your basal ganglia have to get in on it. Your grandmother gives you a dirty look as you approach the yellow traffic light, and it's social disapproval of running that light, basically. And so the social behavior loop is going to process that information, and it's going to say, is this relevant or is this irrelevant? So a lot of the things that go on in social behavior with other humans require us to recognize social clues and regulate ourselves and figure out what's important and what's not. The emotion loop, there's a big connection between emotion and motivation. And the ventral striatum participates in emotions and motivation, acting as a link between emotion, cognitive, and motor systems. So it integrates emotions with the role of other loops. So it's partially responsible for the perception and experience of emotions. And the essential function of the emotion loop is seeking rewards. So a lot of our behavior is sort of reward-seeking behavior, but some of it is just the perception and experience of emotions. So a lot of people who have basal ganglia dysfunction and Parkinson's have a mask-like facial expression, because part of what the emotion loop does is it integrates emotion with the motor systems that control your facial expression. So a lot of the social cues that we read from other people have to do with their facial expressions. And so if you lose that connection, that's where you end up with that mask-like facial expression. Pretty interesting, I think. So the oculomotor loop, it makes decisions about spatial attention and eye movements. So specifically determining whether to use fast eye movements or to direct attention toward an object. So say that you're watching traffic go by, you're trying to make that decision when it's safe to cross the street. And then all of a sudden you see a car you recognize and you direct your attention towards that car. So that is involved in the oculomotor loop. Saccades are rapid movements of the eyes, and antisaccades are the result of more complex interactions that require inhibition of that rapid eye movement reflex. And we'll talk more about those in the vestibular chapter, but the oculomotor loop of the basal ganglia help control those eye movements. So you can see, there's a lot involving having inhibition or disinhibition of reflexes. So if you look at someone read, you see how the eyes go back and forth, jump rapidly back and forth. That is saccadic eye movement, and patients with basal ganglia pathology have impaired saccadic eye movement. So I do have a lot of my Parkinson's patients tell me that it's more difficult for them to read. It's more difficult for them to concentrate when they're reading. So the motor loop, it's the output of cortico-basal ganglia thalamic motor loop. It regulates muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements, and sequencing of movements. This is the classic, what we think of as basal ganglia function. It includes cerebral cortex motor areas, substantia nigra compacta, that's where the dopaminergic cells are, the putamen, the globus pallidus externus, the subthalamic nucleus, the globus pallidus internus, and motor areas of the thalamus. So there's three pathways within that motor loop, that cortico-basal ganglia thalamic loop. The three pathways have the same effects on the other two target nuclei as they do on the motor thalamus. So normal movement requires activity in all three pathways. The HyperDirect Pathway, really the result of the activity in the HyperDirect Pathway is inhibition of the motor thalamus. This is that inhibiting unwanted movements part. So there's excitation from the cerebral cortex to the subthalamic nucleus. And the subthalamic nucleus excites the globus pallidus internus, and the globus pallidus internus inhibits the motor thalamus, so it prevents unwanted movements. So you look at the pathways in the book. There's page 307. There's a little. It looks like an organizational chart, sort of. The basal ganglia inhibiting or disinhibiting different parts. Mainly, I want you to know that the basal ganglia decide which movements to make, and they inhibit unwanted movements. All the details of how it works, don't worry too much about them. Just kind of get an overall view of them. So I think of disinhibition of the motor nucleus. Well, let's talk about the other two pathways, and then I'll talk about my analogy. So the GO pathway activation disinhibits the motor thalamus. That's what I was just about to talk about. So when the GO pathway is activated, goes through that whole pathway, and then you disinhibit, less inhibition to the motor thalamus, causes the motor thalamus to signal motor areas in the cerebral cortex to activate specific corticospinal neurons. So the way I think of this as, it's like the light switch that controls the electrical outlet. The lamp is the motor thalamus. You have to turn it on and plug it into the outlet. Okay, so plugging it into the outlet, that's its cerebral cortex excitation. So the lamp is on, meaning excited, the thalamus is on, it's getting juice from the cerebral cortex, but if the switch is off, it's inhibited. So you need the basal ganglia to turn the switch on to disinhibit the motor thalamus. I hope that makes sense. So then once the motor thalamus is disinhibited, then it can do its thing and signal the motor areas to send a signal down the motor tracks to the motor neurons. But with that switch off, it's inhibited and it's not going to send those pathways. That's the GO pathway. The NoGo pathway results in suppression of unwanted movements. So a lot of the basal ganglia has to do with either suppressing unwanted movements or disinhibiting the motor thalamus to create movement. So even though the basal ganglia, and I've said this a couple times now, have profound effects on movements, they have no direct output to motor neurons. So the motor loop regulates three activities via those three different pathways: voluntary muscle activity, postural and girdle muscle activity, and walking. And all of those are affected with basal ganglia dysfunction in different ways. So dopamine affects those motor pathways. The motor loop is dependent on dopamine supplied by the substantia nigra pars compacta. Dopamine binding to D1 receptors excites the inhibitory neurons in the GO pathway. So doesn't that make you crazy? It excites the inhibitory neurons. It's like a double negative. Dopamine binding to D2 receptors inhibits the neuron. It inhibits the neurons from the putamen to the globus pallidus externus and disinhibits the subthalamic nucleus and facilitates the globus pallidus internus. Okay, well, what does that all mean? It means that the GO-NoGo pathways, the motor loops, are dependent on dopamine in order to work. So when the substantia nigra cells start to die off and stop creating dopamine, it affects our motor pathways. As simple as that. All the details are super interesting, but just know what the effects are. So the basal ganglia tonically inhibit the motor thalamus, the pedunculopontine nucleus, and the MLR. In a normal neuromotor system, the tonic inhibition is selectively decreased or increased depending upon the desired movement. So if you decrease inhibition, it allows a movement to happen. If you increase inhibition, it keeps a movement from happening. Okay, so it is a double negative. Think of it as a double negative. That might help. Movement disorders in basal ganglia dysfunction range from hypokinetic, too little movement, to hyperkinetic, excessive movement. So differences in abnormal movement are due to the dysfunction in the motor pathways within the basal ganglia and the pedunculopontine nucleus. So in the next section, we're going to talk about basal ganglia disorders.